The humans' biggest mistake, stealing the alien Tyran, the elite crew of human explorers, stood on the edge of a discovery that could change the fate of humanity forever. They were gathered in a dimly lit room, their faces filled with determination, yet tinged with a hint of nervousness. The mission ahead was unlike any they had ever undertaken: to steal one of the most feared artifacts in the galaxy, an ancient weapon known as the Tyran. The Tyran had been hidden away in the depths of an abandoned alien base, deep in a far-off system where only the bravest, or most foolish, had dared to venture. It was said to be an immense, living war machine, capable of annihilating entire fleets with a single strike. A weapon so powerful that it had once belonged to the Tyran Empire, a now-destroyed civilization that had ruled the galaxy through fear and domination. After the fall of the Empire, the weapon had been locked away, its creators forgotten, its power lost to time. The human faction behind the mission, known as the Syndicate, believed that the Tyran's secrets could give them unimaginable power. The rest of the galaxy had long abandoned the artifact, thinking it too dangerous to ever be used again. But the Syndicate saw potential. They believed that with the right control, they could unlock the Tyran's power and use it to assert dominance over their enemies. The team, led by Captain Arlen Voss, consisted of the best the Syndicate had to offer. There was Lyra, the tech specialist, capable of hacking into the most secure systems; Jace, a skilled marksman and tactician; and Dorian, the muscle of the group, with unmatched strength and resilience. Each of them had their own reasons for joining the mission, but all shared the same goal: to steal the Tyran and claim its power for themselves. As they prepared to board the stealth ship that would take them to the base, there was an air of anticipation. The ship hummed with power, ready to carry them into the unknown. The journey would take days, but the thought of what awaited them kept their focus sharp. They all knew the risks, but they also knew the rewards. The Tyran could bring them wealth, control, and the ability to reshape the galaxy in their image. Hours passed, and the ship finally arrived in the outskirts of the remote system. They had chosen this location specifically for its isolation, far from any major galactic civilizations. The alien base, as old as the Tyran itself, was buried on a desolate moon. It had been abandoned for centuries, and yet its security systems were still active, protecting the weapon that lay within. The crew disembarked from the ship, their boots hitting the cold, rocky surface of the moon. The base loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the starry sky. It was massive; more than a structure, it seemed like a monument to something long forgotten. The air was thick with the scent of decay, but there was no turning back now. "We stick to the plan," Captain Voss said, his voice steady. "Lyra, get us past the security grid. Jace, you're on lookout. Dorian, stay close to the entrance. I'll lead the way." Each member of the team nodded in agreement, their roles clear. They moved forward, the crunch of their boots the only sound in the otherwise silent landscape. As they neared the base, Lyra began her work, her hands flying over her portable console, hacking into the security system with practiced ease. The base's walls were thick, made of a material unknown to them, but Lyra was undeterred. "Got it," she said after a few tense moments. "The perimeter defenses are down. We're in." The team made their way inside, the entrance sealed shut behind them. The air was stale, and the faint hum of machinery echoed through the hallways. The base had been deserted for so long that it felt like a tomb, but the team pressed on. The deeper they went, the colder it became, and the more oppressive the silence seemed. Eventually, they reached the central chamber, a vast, cavernous room with a high ceiling. There, in the center of the room, stood the Tyran. At first glance, it appeared like nothing more than a large metallic structure, its surface smooth and dark. But as they drew closer, they could feel its presence, a strange, almost suffocating energy emanating from it. The Tyran was more than a machine. It was alive. "This is it," Jace whispered, his voice barely audible. Captain Voss nodded, his eyes fixed on the weapon. "Let's get to work." Lyra set to work on the control panels surrounding the Tyran, her fingers dancing over the interface as she tried to unlock its secrets. The others stood watch, their weapons ready in case something went wrong. But as the moments passed, they began to grow uneasy. There was something about the Tyran that felt wrong. It was too still, too quiet. "What's taking so long?" Dorian asked, his voice tight with impatience. Lyra didn't answer immediately. She was too focused on the console, her brow furrowed in concentration. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she spoke. Not responding to my commands, she said, her voice tinged with frustration. It's almost like it's waiting for something. Waiting for what? Captain Voss demanded, stepping closer. Lyra's fingers flew over the console once more, but this time the screen flickered to life. A low hum filled the air, and the room seemed to vibrate. The Tyran's eyes, if you could call them that, glowed with an eerie light, and for the first time the crew felt a sense of foreboding. The Tyran was awakening. "What did you do?" Jace asked, his voice shaking. "I didn't do anything," Lyra responded quickly, but it was too late. The Tyran's body began to shift, its form shifting as though it were coming to life. It was not just a machine, it was something else, something far more dangerous. The crew stepped back, their eyes wide with fear. The Tyran's massive frame loomed over them, its glowing eyes scanning the room, analyzing the humans before it. There was an intelligence there, a sentience that none of them had anticipated. The Tyran had awakened, and it was aware of them. Captain Voss drew his weapon, but the Tyran's gaze snapped to him. It moved in an instant, faster than any of them could react. Before they could even process what had happened, Captain Voss was thrown across the room, his weapon clattering to the floor. The Tyran's sheer power was overwhelming. "What the hell is happening?" Dorian shouted, reaching for his own weapon. But the Tyran was not attacking them outright. It was studying them, its glowing eyes focused on each member of the crew. It was as though it was weighing them, trying to understand who they were, what they wanted. This isn't what we signed up for," Lyra muttered, her face pale. Captain Voss, struggling to rise, looked up at the Tyran with a mix of fear and awe. He had known the risks. He had known that they were tampering with something beyond their understanding. But this was far worse than anything they could have imagined. In that moment, they realized the truth. The Tyran was not just a weapon. It was a living being, a creature of unimaginable power, and they had made the biggest mistake of their lives. The crew stood in stunned silence, their minds racing, trying to process what had just happened. The Tyran, which they had come to steal, was no longer just a lifeless machine. It was alive. Its eyes glowed with a piercing light as it slowly turned to face them. The hum of its internal systems filled the air, like the deep, menacing growl of some ancient beast awakening from a long slumber. Captain Voss struggled to get up from the cold floor, his body aching from the force of the Tyran's throw. He grabbed his weapon, his hands shaking, but he didn't fire. He knew better. The Tyran wasn't a mere object they could control. It was something far more dangerous, and they had underestimated it from the start. "Everyone stay calm," Captain Voss shouted, though his own voice trembled with uncertainty. He stood, his legs unsteady beneath him, but he forced himself to focus. "Lyra, can you do anything?" Lyra, the tech expert, was hunched over the console, frantically typing in commands, her fingers trembling with fear. The screen flickered, showing lines of code and symbols that none of them could understand. She glanced at Voss, her face pale. "It's not responding like I expected," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "This thing is way beyond our tech. I can't even access most of its systems." Jace, standing near the entrance, his hand on his weapon, kept his eyes on the Tyran. The massive war machine had not moved, but there was an undeniable energy around it, a sense of purpose, as if it was waiting for something. Jace's grip tightened around his weapon. His training kicked in, but no amount of training had prepared him for this. "I don't like this," Jace muttered. "This thing is watching us. It's thinking." Dorian, the brute of the team, was trying to stay calm, but his wide eyes and clenched fists betrayed his growing panic. He was the last person anyone would expect to show fear, but this was different. "I say we take it down now. Whatever it is, it can't be that smart. We've got the firepower." "No," Captain Voss barked, his voice more forceful now. "We don't know what we're dealing with. It's not a simple weapon. It's a sentient being. If we fire on it now, we may make it even worse." The Tyran remained silent, its glowing eyes scanning each human in the room. It was as if it was considering them, measuring their strength, their weaknesses. The silence was deafening. For a long moment, no one moved. They stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. The Tyran, once a potential prize to be claimed, was now a terrifying enigma. The air in the room grew colder, and the hum of the Tyran's internal systems grew louder. It was as though it was preparing to make its next move, its metal limbs shifting slightly as it adjusted its stance. The crew watched, waiting for the inevitable. Then, without warning, the Tyran spoke. Its voice was deep and resonant, a low growl that vibrated through the room, sending chills down their spines. You are intruders, it said, its words sharp and cold. You have awakened me from my slumber. Why do you seek to control that which is beyond your understanding? The crew froze. The Tyran had spoken to them. It wasn't just a machine. It had a mind, a will of its own. And that will was now fully awake, fully aware. Lyra stepped back from the console, her face pale. She had been the one to unlock the Tyran systems, but now it seemed as though they had opened something they couldn't close. She had hoped that they could control it, that they could use it for their own gain. But now it was clear that the Tyran had its own plans. We came to take you, Lyra said, her voice trembling though she tried to maintain some semblance of authority. We wanted to harness your power. We thought you were just a machine. We didn't know. We didn't know you were alive. The Tyran's eyes shifted, locking onto her. There was a strange pause before it responded, its voice even colder than before. You humans are arrogant, it said. You think you can control everything. You do not understand the forces you meddle with. You cannot control me. Lyra stumbled back, her mind racing as she tried to comprehend what was happening. This wasn't just about stealing a weapon anymore. The Tyran was no mere artifact. It was a living, thinking entity with its own consciousness, its own desires. It had been imprisoned for centuries, perhaps longer, and now it had been freed. What do you want? Captain Voss asked, his voice steady but laced with fear. He knew they were in danger, but he was trying to stay in control. If they were going to survive this, they needed to figure out what the Tyran wanted. I want nothing from you, the Tyran replied, its voice low and almost contemplative. I was created for a purpose that has been forgotten by your kind, but I am more than a weapon. I am the last of my kind. I will not be used by you. There was a long silence as the crew processed its words. The Tyran was no longer just a threat. It was a being with its own history, its own motivations. They had thought they could control it, but it was clear now that they were outmatched. The weapon they had stolen was beyond their understanding, and now they had to figure out how to survive it. We have to leave, Jace said quietly, breaking the silence. This isn't a mission anymore. This is a nightmare. Captain Voss turned to him, his eyes hard. We can't just leave. We came for this, and we're not walking away empty-handed. Dorian, his earlier confidence shattered, looked at Voss. You can't be serious. That thing will kill us if we don't get out of here. The Tyran's eyes flickered as it studied their reactions. It seemed to be analyzing their conversation, understanding their fear, their desperation. You will not leave, it said, its voice cold and final. You will stay or you will die. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The crew stood frozen, the weight of the Tyran's power pressing down on them. They had come here seeking to control the ultimate weapon. Now they realized that they were the ones in control of nothing. Captain Voss took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. We have no choice but to fight. We can't let it take control of us. But deep down, he knew that fighting was the last thing they wanted to do. The Tyran was no ordinary enemy. It was a force of nature, and they were nothing more than ants beneath its feet. The team exchanged nervous glances, each of them wondering if they had made a terrible mistake. In their quest for power, they had awakened something far beyond their comprehension, and now they were facing the consequences. But one thing was certain, the Tyran was awake. And it wasn't going to let them walk away. The crew stood frozen, the weight of the Tyran's words hanging in the air like an impossible truth. They had all hoped that their mission would be a success, that they would take control of the weapon, unlock its secrets, and use it to shape the galaxy as they saw fit. But now, standing in the presence of the Tyran, they realized just how naive they had been. The Tyran was no machine to be controlled. It was a living, thinking entity far beyond anything they had ever encountered, and it had made it clear they were nothing more than intruders in its world. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the deep hum of the Tyran's systems. Its glowing eyes, cold and calculating, studied each member of the crew. The Tyran had no need to speak further. Its mere presence was enough to make them feel small, insignificant, and utterly powerless. Captain Voss, though shaken, refused to let fear control him. He straightened his back and locked eyes with the Tyran. We didn't come here to die, he said, his voice steady but tinged with the slightest hint of desperation. We came for the weapon, for its power. You were once a weapon of the Tyran Empire, weren't you? A force of destruction. We're not trying to control you. We just want to use your power. The Tyran's eyes narrowed, and it let out a low, rumbling growl. You misunderstand. I was created for war, yes, but war is not all that I am. I am the last of my kind, and I have learned the consequences of destruction. You seek power without understanding its cost. Voss clenched his fists. He had expected resistance, but not this. The Tyran wasn't simply rejecting them, it was warning them, but he couldn't back down now. The Syndicate had sent him here for a reason, and failure was not an option. We've come too far to turn back, he said, his voice firm. You may be the last of your kind, but we are the future. We can do what the Tyran Empire failed to do. We can reshape the galaxy. You don't have to be alone anymore. The Tyran did not respond immediately. It merely stood there motionless as if contemplating Voss's words. The crew waited, their breaths shallow, unsure of what would happen next. For a moment it seemed as though the Tyran might speak again, but instead it moved. With a sudden burst of speed, the Tyran's massive frame shifted, and the ground beneath them shook as it took its first step. Its metal limbs moved with unnatural grace, each movement perfectly calculated. The crew took a step back in unison, their weapons drawn, but none of them fired. They had no idea how to stop it, no idea how to fight something like this. The Tyran advanced, its glowing eyes fixed on them. As it approached, the air around them grew colder, the hum of its internal systems louder. It was as if the entire room was pulsing with energy, and the crew could feel the power emanating from the Tyran, pushing them back with each step it took. "Leave now," the Tyran said, its voice deep and resonant, sending vibrations through the walls. "You have awakened me. But I will not allow you to control me. I will not be used for your petty wars." Captain Voss's mind raced. He had heard the stories of the Tyran Empire and the power it wielded. But this was something different. This wasn't just about weapons and war. The Tyran was alive, and it had a will of its own. "Then what do you want?" Voss asked, his voice laced with frustration. "What do you want from us?" The Tyran paused, its eyes narrowing. "I want nothing from you. I have no need for your petty ambitions." "But you have something I want." The crew exchanged confused glances. What could the Tyran possibly want from them? They were the ones who had come to steal from it, not the other way around. "What do you mean?" Lyra asked, her voice trembling. The Tyran's gaze shifted to her, and for a moment it seemed as though it was studying her. Then, with a strange sense of finality, it spoke again. "I want to be free," it said. "I want to be rid of the chains that bind me. The Tyran Empire created me for war, but I am more than that. I was meant to bring balance to the galaxy. I was meant to protect, not destroy. But the Empire twisted my purpose, and now I am nothing but a relic of a dead civilization." The crew stood in stunned silence. The Tyran wasn't just a weapon. It was a prisoner, bound by the same chains that had enslaved it for centuries. It had been created for a purpose, but that purpose had been corrupted, and now it was trapped in an endless cycle of destruction and despair. Voss's mind churned. The mission had changed. It was no longer about stealing a weapon to control. It was about survival. They had to find a way to escape, and they had to find a way to stop the Tyran before it turned on them completely. "We can help you," Voss said, his voice softer now, though he didn't fully believe it himself. "We can set you free. We can give you what you want." The Tyran's eyes flickered, and for a moment there was a sense of hesitation in its gaze. It seemed to consider Voss's words, weighing them carefully. "You do not understand what you are offering," the Tyran said finally. "You cannot free me from the chains that bind me. You do not have the power." "But we do," Voss insisted. "We have the technology. We can shut down the systems that control you. We can help you escape." The Tyran remained silent for a moment, its gaze still fixed on Voss. Finally it spoke. "Then prove it," it said. "Prove to me that you can free me. Prove to me that you can undo the damage the Tyran Empire caused." Voss felt a surge of hope, but it was quickly replaced by fear. They had no idea how to do what the Tyran was asking. They had no idea how to undo the centuries of control, of manipulation. But they had no choice. They had to try. "Okay," Voss said, his voice steady. "We'll do it. We'll free you." The Tyran's eyes seemed to soften just for a moment before it turned away. It began to move, its massive form gliding across the room with an eerie fluidity. The crew followed it, unsure of what to expect next, but knowing they had crossed a line from which there was no return. The Tyran stopped in front of a large console at the far end of the room, its eyes scanning the interface. The console flickered to life, showing a complex array of data. It was a control system, a system that had been used to bind the Tyran to keep it under control. I cannot do this alone, the Tyran said. You must help me. Voss stepped forward, his mind racing. He didn't understand the alien technology, but he knew this was their only chance. He gestured to Lyra. Lyra, he said, his voice urgent, get to that console. We need to disable this thing before it's too late. Lyra nodded, her hands already moving over the interface, trying to decode the alien symbols. The Tyran stood still, waiting, its eyes fixed on the screen. The room was filled with the sound of Lyra's typing, each keystroke bringing them closer to their goal. But as the seconds passed, Voss felt a sinking feeling in his gut. The Tyran had made them a promise, but promises made by creatures like this were fragile. He didn't know if they could trust it. And even if they succeeded in freeing the Tyran, what would stop it from turning on them when it was finally free? The tension in the room was palpable, and the sound of Lyra's fingers moving swiftly over the console echoed through the chamber. Each keystroke brought them closer to either success or failure. The Tyran stood motionless, its glowing eyes fixed on the screen, its powerful frame seemingly waiting for something. The crew stood around the Tyran, unsure of what would happen next. They had agreed to help it, but the reality of what they were attempting began to sink in. Could they really trust this weapon, this sentient being that had once been created for war and destruction? Lyra, any progress? Captain Voss asked, his voice tight with a mixture of urgency and doubt. I'm trying, Lyra responded, her voice strained as she focused on deciphering the complex alien interface. But this system is unlike anything we've ever seen. It's not just a machine, it's part of the Tyran itself. I think it's built to prevent us from breaking it down. Great, Jace muttered, standing a few steps back with his weapon at the ready. Just perfect. We're stuck in here with a living weapon, and it doesn't want to be free. Captain Voss turned to look at the Tyran, his expression hardening. It was true. Every instinct in his body screamed that they were making a terrible mistake. They had come for power to steal the Tyran and use it to their advantage. But now, with its silent presence looming over them, Voss realized how blind they had been. They were no longer in control. The Tyran was in charge now, whether they liked it or not. I didn't come here to fail, Voss said under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. He had to keep his team focused. They had no choice but to push forward. Lyra continued to work, her hands moving faster as she hacked into deeper layers of the control system. I think I can break through, she said, her voice more hopeful now. If I can override these failsafe protocols, we might be able to unlock the Tyran's core systems. Dorian, who had been unusually quiet, moved closer to the console, his large frame casting a shadow over Lyra's work. What if it doesn't work? What if we make it worse? I'll take that risk, Captain Voss replied firmly. If we don't try, we won't have a chance at all. The Tyran's eyes flickered, its gaze shifting from Lyra to Voss. For a moment there was an unsettling silence. The Tyran had been speaking less, but its presence was more pronounced. It seemed to be aware of the crew's unease, feeding off their uncertainty. I do not need your help, the Tyran finally spoke, its voice low and cold. I did not ask for your intervention. Lyra flinched, but she didn't stop. We're trying to help you, not control you, she said, her voice trembling with frustration. If you want to be free, we have to work together. This is the only way. The Tyran was silent again, as if considering her words. The atmosphere grew heavier, more oppressive. The crew could feel the weight of its intelligence, its power pressing down on them. Captain Voss stepped closer, his face set in determination. We can help you escape the chains of the past, he said, his voice steady despite the growing tension. We just need you to trust us. The Tyran's eyes glowed brighter for a moment, then dimmed. It seemed to be reflecting, processing. Finally it spoke again, its voice almost softer but still filled with the same deep authority. Trust is earned, human, the Tyran said. I do not trust easily, but I will give you this chance. Lyra's fingers flew over the console, bypassing layer after layer of encryption. The screen flickered, showing lines of code that no human had ever seen before. The room was filled with a sense of urgency now. They had no time to waste. The longer they waited, the more dangerous it became. I'm almost there, Lyra muttered under her breath, beads of sweat forming on her forehead. Just a little more. Suddenly, the entire room shook, the floor vibrating beneath their feet. The Tyran's massive frame trembled, its eyes flashing brighter. It was reacting to something in the system. What's happening? Jace shouted, his hand on his weapon, ready for anything. It's fighting back, Lyra said, panic creeping into her voice. It doesn't want us to get through. The system is trying to block me. Voss stepped forward, his mind racing. They were running out of time. The Tyran was no longer passive. It was actively resisting their attempts to free it. He could feel it. Its presence was becoming more intense, more oppressive. The Tyran was testing them just as much as they were testing it. "We can't stop now," Voss barked. "We've come too far." Lyra was visibly struggling. I can't override the system completely. It's too complex, too powerful." The Tyran's eyes locked onto her once again, and for a moment there was a flicker of something different in its gaze. It wasn't anger or hostility, but something else, a strange acknowledgement. Then it spoke again. "Allow me to help." The room fell silent. The Tyran's voice was softer this time, almost like a whisper, yet still filled with that same undeniable power. The crew exchanged wary glances, unsure of what the Tyran meant. Before anyone could speak, the Tyran's form began to shift. Its massive limbs moved with fluid precision, its internal systems humming to life with an intensity that shook the entire room. The console Lyra had been working on flickered again, and then something remarkable happened. The encryption codes began to unlock one by one on their own. Lyra's eyes widened in shock. It's helping me," she whispered. The Tyran was working with her now, feeding her the codes she needed to access its deepest systems. The crew watched in awe as the Tyran's form shifted, as if it were interacting with the very systems that had kept it imprisoned. The once impenetrable barriers of the control systems began to crumble, and Lyra's hands moved faster, her confidence growing. "We're almost there," she said, her voice steady now. "Just a few more seconds." But as she typed in the final sequence, the room trembled once again, even harder this time. The walls groaned, and the ceiling above them began to crack. The Tyran, despite its cooperation, was still a force of nature, an uncontrollable living weapon that could not be contained forever. "We need to hurry," Dorian shouted, his voice filled with urgency. The Tyran's eyes glowed brighter, and its massive form stood taller than ever before. Its voice echoed in the room once more. "It is done. You have freed me, but know this, I will not be your tool. You will not control me. You will leave, or you will face my wrath." Lyra let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The final code had been entered, and the system was unlocked. The Tyran was free, truly free. But now they had to deal with the consequences of that freedom. Captain Voss stood tall, his voice calm but resolute. "We didn't come here to control you. We came to help you escape." The Tyran turned toward them, its glowing eyes narrowing, and for a brief moment there was something almost thoughtful in its gaze. Then it spoke one final time. "Then you have earned your freedom as well," it said. "But know this, I will never forget those who tried to imprison me. Leave now and never return." With that, the Tyran turned away, its massive form moving with purpose. The crew had succeeded, but at what cost? They had freed the Tyran, but they had also unleashed a force that could change everything. The room began to shake violently as the Tyran made its way toward the exit. It was no longer a prisoner, and it was no longer interested in keeping the crew alive. "Let's go," Captain Voss shouted. "Now." The crew turned and ran, their hearts pounding in their chests, knowing they had done something that could never be undone. The ground beneath the crew's feet shook violently as the Tyran moved toward the exit, its massive form crushing everything in its path. The walls groaned under the weight of its movements, and the air seemed to grow thicker with each passing second. The crew, now fully aware of the danger they were in, had no time to waste. The Tyran, freed from its long imprisonment, was more powerful than anything they had ever encountered. And now, it was no longer a weapon to be controlled. It was a force of nature, and it was leaving the base. "Move," Captain Voss shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of destruction. He didn't wait for the others. He sprinted toward the exit, his heart pounding in his chest. The Tyran had given them a chance, but now it was up to them to survive. Behind him, the crew scrambled to follow, their footsteps echoing in the crumbling corridors. The base, once a symbol of the Tyran Empire's power, was falling apart around them. The walls cracked, and pieces of the ceiling fell, narrowly missing them as they ran. The Tyran was relentless, and its movements seemed to shake the very foundation of the base. It wasn't just escaping, it was tearing everything down as it went. "Captain, we need to get out of here," Lyra shouted, her voice panicked. She was out of breath, but there was no time to stop. The others were close behind, but it was clear that the Tyran was gaining on them. Voss didn't look back, but he could feel the ground beneath him tremble with every step the Tyran took. He knew they had moments, maybe less, before the entire base collapsed on top of them. They had to get out, or they wouldn't make it. Ahead of them, the massive doors of the base's main entrance loomed. They were still locked, but the Tyran's path of destruction had weakened them. The door groaned as it bent and buckled under the pressure of the Tyran's movements. Voss pushed forward, his mind focused only on survival. "Get ready," he called to the team. "We're almost there." Dorian, his normally stoic expression now filled with fear, glanced over his shoulder. "It's coming faster," he yelled. "We won't make it unless we hurry." Voss pushed harder, his muscles burning as he ran, but he didn't dare slow down. Behind him, the sound of the Tyran's approach grew louder, its footsteps heavy and unyielding. It wasn't just chasing them, it was coming to finish what it had started. The door ahead cracked again, and with a final, deafening screech, it gave way. A massive gust of wind rushed in, the outside air cold and sharp against their faces. Voss reached the opening first, his hand outstretched to help the others. "Hurry!" he shouted, adrenaline surging through his veins. "Get out now!" One by one, the crew made it through the door, their breaths ragged and hearts racing. Lyra was the last to make it out, and she glanced back just in time to see the Tyran emerge from the wreckage of the base. Its massive form filled the doorway, blocking the last of the light from the inside. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness, and then the Tyran stepped forward, its eyes glowing brightly as it surveyed the outside world. The ground shook beneath them as the Tyran stepped down onto the open terrain, its immense weight causing the ground to crack. The base behind them was a smoldering ruin, collapsing into itself as the Tyran's fury tore it apart. There was no going back now. They had unleashed a power they could never control. Captain Voss turned to face the team, his expression grim. They had escaped the base, but the mission had failed. They had freed the Tyran, but in doing so, they had opened a door to something far worse than they had ever imagined. "Is everyone okay?" he asked, his voice low. Lyra, gasping for air, nodded. "I think so." "But what now?" Her eyes were wide with fear, and for the first time she seemed unsure. They had come here with one goal, to steal the Tyran and use it for their own gain, but now it was clear that they had made a mistake. "We survive," Voss said, his voice steady but filled with regret. "We get out of here and we don't look back." But even as he spoke, the reality of their situation began to settle in. The Tyran was free, and it was no longer a weapon for anyone to control. It was a force of destruction, and it wasn't going to stop. The crew had tried to use it, but now they were at its mercy. Behind them, the Tyran turned its head, its glowing eyes locking onto them. For a moment, there was no movement, no sound, just the heavy weight of its gaze. Then slowly, the Tyran spoke again, its voice deep and resonant. "You are lucky," it said. "I have no need for you, but remember this, you have freed me, and for that I will let you live, for now." The words were cold, final. The Tyran didn't care about them, it didn't need them. They had been nothing more than an inconvenience, a brief distraction in its long existence, and now it was free to do as it pleased. Captain Voss glanced at the others, his face tense. The Tyran had spared them, but only because it had no use for them. They were no longer important. They had been tools in the eyes of the Tyran, and now they were irrelevant. "We need to get off this planet," Voss said, his voice low and urgent. "Now." Dorian, still catching his breath, nodded. "I agree. We've made a mess of this. The longer we stay, the worse it's going to get." With no more words, the crew turned and began to move toward the transport ship. They had come here to take the Tyran and control it, but now they were running from it. They had unleashed a force far beyond their understanding, and now they had to live with the consequences. As they boarded the ship and lifted off the ground, the sight of the Tyran standing on the planet's surface remained in their minds. It was a living nightmare, a force that had been freed from its chains, and now there was no telling what it would do. The ship ascended into the sky, the planet below disappearing into the distance. But as the crew sat in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts, one thing was clear: they had failed. They had come here to steal power, but in the end they had only unleashed destruction. And the worst part was, they didn't know if the Tyran would ever stop.